Breakups are tough, even when you know they're for the best. I've been trying to keep myself together after splitting up with my boyfriend of 2.5 years. I don't really want to get into it, it wasn't messy or dramatic. We just weren't right for each other anymore. But that didn't make it any easier. Some days it felt like everything reminded me of him. I'd been forcing myself to stick to no contact, telling myself that it was the healthiest way for both of us to move on. It was hard though, really hard. One of the things I missed most about us was playing pool together. It was our thing. I'm a pretty decent player, definitely better than average, but my ex, he was incredible. On his good days he could pull off trick shots like it was nothing. 1-rail, 2-rail banks, kicks, combinations. I'm pretty sure he was even learning a standard mass. We each had pool tables at home, but obviously, we were young, and staying inside every night wasn't exactly ideal. When we did go out, we always made sure that wherever we were going, usually a bar, had some pool tables. We hated crowded bars with long waits for tables and screaming patrons though. So the places we went were quieter, usually attracting an older crowd. Dive bars with old scuffed tables and sticky floors were our sweet spot. Obviously you can't expect to find a regulation table in pristine condition at any bar, but the dive bars were definitely a better shout than rowdy college bars. We were usually the youngest people there, but we didn't care. At that point in our relationship, we had grown somewhat bored of the typical college, let's get plastered every night mentality. Plus, even though I'm kind of shy, my ex was pretty charismatic and would get along with anyone. Us not being total newbies at pool didn't hurt either. A few weeks ago, I found myself missing that part of my life more than usual. It was a random Wednesday though, so none of my friends were free. I didn't want to sit around the house feeling sorry for myself anymore, so I decided to head out to one of the bars we used to go to. I told myself it wasn't about nostalgia, that I just needed to get out. Believe me, I'm not the type of person, nor do I usually have the confidence to go out by myself, but I was feeling some type of way that night. The bar was exactly the same as I remembered. Dim lighting, worn-out stools, a jukebox in the corner. The familiarity was comforting, but it also stung. The memories came flooding back and I almost turned around and left right then. But I forced myself to stay. After grabbing a few drinks, I wandered over to one of the pool tables and started idly chalking a cue. I'm not really sure what I was planning on doing there. Playing alone would have been a little odd. Luckily, my question was answered because a guy walked over. He was maybe in his mid-20s, the only person in the room even close to my age. He leaned against the table and asked if I was up for a game. I nodded and told him to rack 'em up. He put some money in the slot and started racking the balls. I laughed to myself as he racked them wrong, but I didn't say anything. We played a few rounds and I started to relax. He wasn't bad, not as good as my ex, but not terrible. I wasn't going easy on him though. I won every rack we played. We chatted as we played and he even bought me a couple of drinks. He was friendly enough, but it quickly became clear he wasn't the brightest guy in the world. I like sharp, quick-witted guys who can hold their own in a conversation. This guy? Not so much. Still, I didn't mind. It felt good to just play and talk and not overthink things for once. I was having a good time. After the fourth game, he popped the question, asking if I wanted to go back to his place. The question caught me off guard, but I guess I couldn't have been too shocked. I froze for a second before shaking my head. I tried to make it playful, saying he'd need a second date for that. In all honesty, I just didn't want to move so quickly. I guess I didn't do a good job turning him down though, because his entire demeanor changed. His smile dropped, and he literally started scowling at me. I was not prepared for what happened next. He said, "Are you serious?" and grabbed my wrist, saying something about spending all that money on those drinks. Before I could respond, he snatched my purse too. I had never been in a situation like that, so instead of screaming or fighting, I just kind of froze up. Even though we were in a public place, I was still terrified. Luckily, a couple of older guys at the bar noticed what was happening and stepped in. I'm honestly not sure what I would have done had they not. One of them told the guy to let me go. The guy glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and threw my purse back onto the table before storming right out of the bar. My heart was still racing, and I thanked those guys profusely for helping me out. That was it for me, though. I called an Uber and left the bar, still kind of shocked and trying to process what had just happened. As I rummaged through my bag for my keys, I impulsively checked my phone for the first time since leaving the bar. That's when I saw it. That god-awful notification AirTag found moving with you. I nearly dropped my phone. My hand started to shake as I rummaged through my purse, tossing aside my wallet and makeup until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. I pulled it out and stared in disbelief. There was literally an AirTag in my bag. A wave of panic hit me, way worse than what I was feeling earlier. I was still standing in the middle of the street, so I threw it on the ground and stomped on it a bunch of times until I was sure it was broken. I fought back a scream and started breathing heavily. The cold wasn't helping. I needed to get inside. I looked around frantically, but the street was completely empty. Whoever had planted the AirTag, probably that guy from the bar, would know exactly where I was. As I was looking out the window, kind of mindlessly, I noticed an old beat-up Lincoln drive slowly past my house. Nothing too unusual, but it was kind of late for cars to be driving on a residential road. But then it came back from the opposite direction, and I knew something was wrong. It passed even slower the second time, like the driver was scanning the houses. I didn't want to face the reality of the situation, but when it passed the third time, I had no choice. It was the guy. It had to be. He was trying to find my house. I wanted to scream again. The next time the car passed, the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't want that guy to know he was in the right area. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I was so scared and couldn't think straight. The next time the car passed, the driver's hand was hanging out of the window holding something. It looked like a knife. And then instead of driving past, the car stopped in the middle of the road right across from my house. I ducked down, my heart beating a million beats a minute again. I stayed there, crouched below the window, too terrified to move. By the time I looked up, the car was gone. I waited for what must have been an hour, but it didn't come back. The next morning I told my parents everything. My dad scolded me for not calling the police, but I told him I was too scared to. He called a buddy of his, a police chief, to ask for advice. His friend said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence or the car's plate number, which I hadn't been able to see. His friend told us to call the police immediately should we ever see that car again. I didn't leave the house for days. Even now I'm really scared that he's waiting somewhere and is going to see me enter or exit my house again. I haven't seen the car since though, so maybe the nightmare is over. I don't have the most exciting life, but it's comfortable. I'm 40, single, no kids. Some people might find that depressing, but honestly, I don't mind. I've got a steady job, a decent house, and no one to answer to but myself. I work as a bartender at a high-end luxury rooftop bar in a neighboring town, catering to the kind of clientele who think regular bars are beneath them. I don't live anywhere near that level of luxury myself. My place is in a pretty middle-of-the-road neighborhood about 20 minutes away, but working there has its perks. The tips are amazing. People in that area aren't shy about throwing money around, and the rotating crowd keeps things interesting. Since the bar is upscale, we don't have the typical regulars you find in a dive bar. I like that. I've never been a fan of how close some customers get with bartenders. Maybe that's just me. I prefer to keep to myself. I should probably mention my name's Kevin. That'll be important later. It was a Friday night, our busiest night. The place was packed as usual with groups of friends clinking glasses, couples on date nights, and a few folks who probably wandered in just to feel important. I always like playing a mental game with my patrons. I try to figure out which ones are pretending to be something they're not. You can tell a lot about people by the way they order a drink. The ones who ask for complicated cocktails are usually trying to impress someone. The ones who order whiskey neat, they've had a day. I had my eye on a couple at the end of the bar who were down to their last sips of wine. It's always better to offer a refill before they wave you down. I was in my groove, mixing drinks and chatting with customers, when I noticed someone walk in who definitely looked out of place. I clocked the guy immediately. He was clenching his teeth and scowling like he was furious. He had jet black hair that wasn't combed and sat like a bird's nest on his forehead. He was wearing a blank black hoodie under a faded leather jacket that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were stains all over it. But none of that was as unsettling as his face. Like I said, he just looked so angry. He made a beeline for the bar, but he didn't sit down. He just stood there, staring at me. I wondered to myself how he had gotten past the doorman in the lobby. I cleared my throat and asked if I could get him something to drink, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the weird vibe he was giving off. He didn't answer right away, which was strange. He just kept glaring at me, like he was getting ready to swing. Finally he muttered that he wanted a double shot of Jaeger. I nodded, grabbed a glass and poured the shot. Jaeger isn't a drink we pour often here. Most of our patrons are likely to ask for something a little higher quality. But hey, if someone wants Jaeger, I'm not about to question their taste. I set the glass in front of him and moved on to serve a few other patrons. When I came back to charge him, he tossed crumpled cash onto the counter. That also threw me off. Hardly anyone pays in cash at this place. Again though, it wasn't my place to judge. The guy didn't say anything as I rang him up, and I was ready to move on when he spoke again. I still remember his exact words. "I knew I'd find you here, Kevin." I froze. My eyes snapped to his as I scrambled to process what he just said. I put the glass in my hand down and demanded to know how he knew my name. I didn't want to make a scene, so I kept my voice low, but I hoped he got the gist of how serious I was. He didn't answer my question, just stared at me with the same angry intensity. Finally he said, "I know what you did." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked toward the elevators. I wanted to yell something or chase after him, but I decided against it. I was on the clock. I couldn't just neglect my job. Instead, I just stood there for a moment, completely thrown off. I was, honest to God, confused out of my mind. I didn't recognize him in the slightest. I couldn't think of anything I had done that would warrant such a cryptic statement. I'm no saint, but I don't go around making enemies. It put me in a sour mood for the rest of the night. When my shift finally ended, I drove home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier. I racked my brain for literally any explanation that made sense, but couldn't think of any. By the time I ended up going to bed, I was still relatively unsettled by the whole thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up randomly. I wasn't really sure what woke me up. I didn't have to go to the bathroom, and I'm usually the type of person to sleep through the night. I didn't hear or see anything, but something felt off. Without moving, I kept my eyes open, waiting for them to adjust to the darkness. After about a minute, I saw something that gave me an adrenaline rush of fear. There was a dark mass in the corner of my room next to the door. It was just standing there, but I was 100% sure it was something that didn't belong in my room. I felt my heart start to race, but I forced myself to stay still, pretending to still be asleep. Someone was in my room. I repeated that thought to myself like 6 times before truly processing it. I knew I had to do something. I counted silently to 3, and in one quick motion, I sprung out of bed screaming like a crazy person. I was prepared for a fight, but the figure didn't come toward me. Instead, he bolted for the door. As he moved, I heard something clatter to the floor. I chased after him through my house, but by the time I reached the front door, it was wide open, and whoever had been in my room was gone. I wanted to run out into the yard to look for him, but I was worried that I'd be walking directly into a trap. Instead, I made what I still think is the smart decision. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I thought back to the clatter I had heard earlier in my room. I walked back to my bedroom, turned on the light, and froze. In the corner of the room, there was a knife just lying there on the floor. It was one of mine, taken from the kitchen. I felt sick. Whoever I had just chased was planning to hurt me, possibly kill me. I called the police right after that, and they quickly arrived and searched both my house and yard but found nothing. I gave a description of the man from the bar and the police got the video footage from my bar, but they haven't been able to find him yet. I haven't heard anything. The thing that freaks me out the most is that I know for a fact I had locked all my doors that night. I locked them every night. During their search, though, the police were never able to figure out how that man entered my house. None of the windows were broken or unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry. To this day, I still have no idea how he got inside. I haven't seen him since, but I would be lying if I said I don't think about this encounter often. Music fades out. What I'm about to tell you is the strangest experience I've ever lived through. My name is Mary. My friend Carol and I were driving from Florida to New Jersey a few months back. We were coming back from visiting some friends who went to school down there. It was a really fun time, but Carol and I had to get on with our lives. The drive was supposed to be fun. A little road trip, just us two, with snacks, music, and time to catch up on things we hadn't talked about in ages. In hindsight, it probably would have been a better idea to stay one more night at our friend's place, but I was eager to get home. We planned to do the whole drive in one shot, through the night and into the next morning. A few hours after the sun came up, my back started to ache from sitting in the same position for so long. I told Carol we should pull over for a break, grab some gas, and maybe find something to eat before getting back on the road. We passed a few more exits before getting off at what was advertised as a lively touristy town. For the life of me, I can't remember the name of the town. It was supposed to be a tourist stop, with signs pointing to attractions and unique shops. But as we pulled in, I felt something was off. The streets were empty and the buildings looked run down, too much so for a place catering to visitors. It's hard to explain, but you could just something was wrong, even though nothing specific jumped out at you. It was like one of those ghost towns where all the shop signs are still up, but everything is clearly abandoned. Our first stop was a convenience store. We had to drive a bit before reaching the town center. Once inside, it actually seemed pretty normal. Carol was looking for a specific drink but couldn't find it. She got frustrated, and I agreed to check somewhere else. I paid for my drink and left. Across the street, we saw another convenience store and decided to try there. As soon as we walked in, I felt my stomach drop. The cashier looked like the one from the first store. Same face, same height, same everything. I froze, staring at her, and could tell I was making her uncomfortable. Eventually I asked if she had a twin or a sister. She gave me a weird, skeptical look and said no, she was an only child. Then she told me it was a strange question to ask. I tried to explain myself, but she didn't say anything else. I felt this intense déjà vu and dragged Carol out of the store. She was confused, but I explained what I had seen. She said she didn't remember what the first cashier looked like and thought I was just tired. I insisted I wasn't imagining things and ran back to the first store. When we got there, the cashier inside looked nothing like the one I had seen earlier. This woman was short, with light hair and middle-aged, completely different. It was like I had imagined the whole thing. Carol told me to let it go and chalked it up to exhaustion. We needed gas, so we pulled into a station. It was completely empty. No cars, just us. After paying, we walked out, and what had been an empty station moments earlier was now packed. Every pump was filled with cars, and there were even lines waiting. All the parking spots in the back were full too. It felt like every person there was staring at us as we walked to our car. Carol agreed something weird was going on, and we decided to leave as fast as possible. Back on the road, we didn't say much for a while. About 10 minutes later, a Toyota Sienna passed us. I distinctly remember it because of its cracked windshield and scratches on the side. It was hard to miss. Carol even made a joke about it. Then 10 minutes later, the same minivan passed us again. We were sure of it. The crack in the windshield was unmistakable. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of us again. Carol started panicking and told me to speed up. I was freaking out inside, but I kept driving and tried to stay calm for her sake. I glanced at the GPS and noticed an hour had somehow passed since we left the gas station, even though that was impossible. I didn't mention it to Carol, but my heart was racing. It felt like we were stuck in some kind of loop. Finally, we got back on the highway and left that strange place behind. By the time we got home, it felt like we had woken up from a bizarre, disjointed dream. Even now, when I think back to that day, it feels surreal. I've tried researching similar experiences and found a few stories that sound familiar, but I still can't explain what happened. The weirdest part was the gut feeling I had the whole time, like every bone in my body was screaming that something was wrong. I never want to feel that way again. I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me, and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar, and when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it has something to do with management being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular, even though I personally don't think it's anything super special. The atmosphere is lively most nights, with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests, but that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rowdier environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips. Which kind of sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered he used the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour. I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either, no food and definitely not any drinks. I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each other. They were both fixated on the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slammed, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached, neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just stared at me and shook his head once, firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She then jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me. But on the inside, though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory, but like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street there were two dark figures standing under a lone street light. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any kind of explanation. I don't think I ever will. My family has this beat-up 2012 Volvo that is quite literally on its last legs. I don't know what it is, but the thing refuses to quit. It's had a million problems, but still runs. The thing has a laundry list of issues, brakes that feel soft, a temperamental engine, and half the electronics barely work. My parents are basically waiting for it to break down for good, so that they'll have an excuse to get a new car. Unfortunately, I'm the one stuck driving it. In addition to the myriad of other issues it's suffering from, the windshield wipers don't work at all. So driving in the rain is a death sentence. Even a little drizzle is enough to completely obstruct the driver's view. Everyone knows Nevada is the driest state though, so rain typically isn't a concern where I live. I remember elementary school teachers always making a big deal about that fact for some reason. Anyway, this was back in the summer a couple of years ago. I was on my way back from a solo trip to visit my friend Kelvin a few states over. One of those friends I hadn't seen in years. I love driving, so I figured I'd make an adventure out of it, just driving alone through stretches of empty desert. The drive there was great. I stayed a few nights at his place and we did a lot of drinking. It was a great time and I was glad I made the effort. The majority of the drive back was a piece of cake, but that didn't last long. As I crossed into Nevada, a storm hit. Not just a sprinkle or some light rain, an actual thunderstorm, complete with lightning and torrents of rain. I later realized that it was one of the heaviest rainfalls we'd seen in years. I'd driven through rain before, but nothing like this. It didn't really make much of a difference with the current state of my windshield wipers. Any amount of rain would force me to pull over, so reluctantly, that's what I did. I pulled off the highway and parked a considerable distance into the desert just in case a truck or something didn't see me. I figured I had no choice but to wait it out. Maybe try to get some sleep in the car. I debated calling the police for assistance with the wipers, but money was tight, and I wanted to avoid a ticket at all costs. If not the wipers, they definitely get me on something else. I wasn't about to ask my 65-year-old parents to drive 3.5 hours to rescue me either, so sitting and waiting was my only move. I was on my own, alone on the side of the road during a thunderstorm in the middle of the desert. Not a single car passed me for a full hour, and the storm didn't even let up a smidge. I think being alone in the desert started messing with my head, because after about another hour I got this unsettling feeling. I'm not sure what it was, but I got this unexplainable urge to move the car. It was still pouring, so I obviously couldn't do that safely. I found myself nervously looking out each of the car's windows as if there was something out there. There obviously wasn't. All I could see were miles and miles of endless rocks and desert. The sun was just about to be setting though, which would soon cast my surroundings in darkness. I hadn't expected the storm to persist this long, so the reality of having to spend the night out in the desert hadn't even occurred to me. I fully admit that the thought of not being able to see what was out there spooked me. I don't exactly scare easily, but I had heard enough desert stories to be understandably cautious. As if my thoughts were being read, the storm began to subside a bit. I took that as a sign that I'd be able to get back on the road soon, which was a relief. The sun started to set, casting that strange, muted twilight across the desert. Under different circumstances, I would have admired the beauty of it. The damn rain wasn't stopping though, so I had no choice but to stay put. I tried to concentrate on the lightning in the distance, thinking maybe that would ease my mind. I don't remember how much longer I waited, but eventually the sun set completely. At that point, I decided waiting was wasting valuable energy, and I'd be better off trying to get some shut-eye. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I saw flashes in the distance. It wasn't lightning this time, just bright, sharp bursts of white light darting through the darkness. They seemed to jump around like they were coming from multiple places. It was creepy as hell. I watched them for a few more minutes before realizing that they were getting closer. They were literally approaching me. I could feel my palms starting to sweat. I don't know what came over me, but instinct kicked in, and I made a split-second decision to get out of the car and hide. I grabbed my phone, scrambled out, and ran to hide behind the nearest rock formation. It was still raining, but I didn't care. I could feel my heart beating rapidly, and I prayed that the sound of the rain would conceal my breathing. Crouching low, I peeked around the edge, watching my car from a distance. After a few minutes, I realized what the flashes were. Flashlights. I saw 3 figures moving through the distance toward my car, each equipped with a flashlight. They were flinging their beams around wildly as if dancing or stumbling or something. It was abnormal, I'm telling you. They circled my car, inspecting it as if they were looking for something, or someone. I'm telling you though, the way they wielded their flashlights, it was like they were on something. I squinted, trying to make out details, but it was too dark to see much. Without warning, one of them fired a gunshot at the sky. I jumped, completely caught off guard, and I bit down on my lips so hard I broke the skin. Every instinct told me to stay as still as possible, to make myself invisible behind the rocks. For what felt like forever, I stayed frozen in place, not daring to peek behind the rock. Eventually, the curiosity was unbearable. Slowly, I peered behind the rock again, and I felt my stomach drop. It was pitch black. No flashlights. I waited, not sure where those people had gone. And then, just like that, the lights were back, flickering around my car again like they were taunting me. I knew I couldn't stay there all night. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone, fumbling to dial 911. I whispered into the phone, trying to explain what was happening with my voice barely audible. The operator said they'd send someone, and I put the phone down, feeling both relieved and terrified. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the faint glow of police lights in the distance. The second the lights started flashing, the 3 figures turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness. By the time the cop actually pulled up next to my car, they were long gone. I ran through the rain, waving my arms, grateful that I had been saved. The officer listened as I told him everything. He didn't seem particularly shocked, which somehow made all of it feel worse. He did have the courtesy of waiting out the storm with me and not towing my vehicle, which I guess I could say was a good thing. I think about this often, and I haven't done a road trip since. I'm from New Hampshire. Back in my early 20s, I lived about 30 minutes outside Manchester. I had a girlfriend of 2 years that I had just broken up with. It was a strange time in my life, the kind where you're sort of wandering, figuring things out, maybe looking for meaning without realizing it. My grandmother was extremely religious and would attend liturgy, well, religiously, no pun intended. After my grandfather passed away, I started going to church with her every Sunday. I tagged along partly to support her and partly because I felt like maybe I needed a bit of grounding myself. My grandfather had been a decorated veteran, well known and respected in our community, and losing him left a huge hole in her life. Even though she was grieving, her faith was unshaken. She told me that she knew he was finally reunited with the Lord, and I could see how much comfort that gave her. I admired it honestly. Faith like that, the kind that brings real peace, is rare. I think it's something that people search for their whole lives, even if they can't always put it into words. One Sunday after the service, I met this girl. This whole thing still feels like a fever dream. I'd never seen her around before, which was unusual since our community was close-knit, especially at church. She was striking, with dark curly hair and deep hazel eyes. I waited for the service to be over and approached her. Part of me was just attracted to her, but there was another part of me that was just curious about seeing someone new there, especially someone that looked around my age. We started talking, and the spark was definitely there. I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about, where you just meet someone and immediately feel a connection. Her name was Kaylee, and she had a kind of quiet, mysterious charm. I found myself drawn in. I kept trying to ask her specific questions about her past, like family and home life, but she would crack jokes and tell me I'd have to take her out for those answers. I actually really enjoyed the banter. After a little playful nagging, she told me that her family recently moved to the area, and she went to college nearby, which explained why I had never seen her before. By the time we wrapped up, I managed to get her number, and I was kind of riding the high of meeting someone new. Over the next week, we texted pretty frequently and exchanged social media. I remember scrolling through her Instagram at one point, surprised that she had so few followers. I preferred that though. The last thing anyone wants is to fall in love with someone that the whole world knows. We talked about a lot of things, and she eventually opened up more about her family. I don't want to say too much, but her situation wasn't great. Her stepfather was a nasty alcoholic and frequently mistreated both her and her mother. Her biological father was substantially worse, though she wouldn't give me specific details. Apparently they had to move to get away from him. She transferred schools and everything, leaving everyone and everything she had known behind. I didn't want to overstep and ask her about her father. I was just glad she was opening up to me. As much as I loved the calculated mystique, it was nice to get to know her on a more personal level. I neglected to coordinate a date with her just yet because I figured I'd see her at church the following Sunday. She was there again. I took it as a sign and asked her on a date after the service. She didn't hesitate, she just smiled and said yes, and we made plans to meet up later that week. I spent the rest of the week thinking about her, nervous about our first date. When the night finally came, we kept things simple. We saw a movie and grabbed a bite to eat, nothing fancy, just an easy night where we could talk and get to know each other even more. I honestly thought it was going really well. She was a great listener, and she seemed genuinely interested, which was refreshing. I didn't want the night to end just yet, so after dinner I suggested going for a little drive, thinking it'd give us a chance to keep talking without the noise of a restaurant around us. So we hit the highway, driving out of town a bit. We were driving along one of those roads that was technically a highway, but looked more like a normal 2-lane road. It was windy and there were trees on either side of it. Everything was perfect. It's crazy how things can change in an instant. What I'm about to describe to you is something I will never be able to purge from my mind. Out of nowhere she started speaking, but it wasn't in English. Her words were fast, mumbled, and sounded like French or something close to it. At first I thought she was maybe joking or testing me, but then I noticed her eyes. They rolled back, leaving only the whites. I swerved the car and almost crashed into the barrier. My heart started pounding because it looked like she was in some kind of trance or having a seizure. I got a hold of myself and pulled over to the shoulder, trying to stay calm. At that point, I was internally panicking. I fumbled for my phone and called for an ambulance, not knowing what to say other than I thought she was having a seizure. As I waited, I kept checking on her, unsure if she even knew where she was. She was still talking, and her head seemed to be vibrating. I didn't know what the hell to do. I didn't want to touch her, but I felt like I had to do something. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. She snapped her head to look at me and shut her mouth. She blinked, with her eyes going back to normal, and she gave me this wild, wide-eyed expression. I will never forget that look as long as I live. Before I could say a word, she threw open the car door and literally sprinted full speed into the woods. I'll say that again. She literally ran into the woods. I was trying to make sense of what just happened, but I just couldn't move. My head was spinning, and I'm pretty sure my hands were still trembling. I sat in that position until the cops and paramedics showed up. I told them everything, even though it sounded insane. Every detail about the way her eyes looked and how she'd run off. They nodded and took my statement, assuring me that they'd try their best to find her. I must have looked insane, but they took me seriously enough. After that night, though, she was gone. I never saw her again. I looked for her at church, but she never showed up. Her Instagram was deleted, and she had apparently blocked my number. It was worse than that. I got a friend to text her number, and it apparently had been erased. No amount of internet stalking ever turned anything up. I even asked people at the church if they knew her, but no one did. I don't know what happened to her, and I'm not sure I'll ever know. I don't live there anymore, and my memory of home is kind of messed up because of the incident. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The air was thick with an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I remember standing there, frozen, as if time itself had come to a standstill. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the stillness, jolting me back to reality. My heart raced and my mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. It was then that I realized this was no ordinary night. Something was terribly wrong. In the days that followed, the weight of that night hung heavily over me. The incident had left an indelible mark, one that I couldn't shake off. I found myself replaying the events over and over, searching for answers that seemed just out of reach. Friends and family tried to comfort me, but their words felt hollow, unable to bridge the gap between their world and mine. I knew deep down that life would never,